So now into our first session on the economy, business and finance. And the first question is a pre-question from both, actually, we've had a few questions around this particular topic, but in particular Fiona Burns and John Turner. And it's the big one, moving away from GDP as a measure of success. Can we, should we, how do we? Chamali, do you want to take that?
I think it's very important that people remember without money you can't actually achieve anything in government. So we do have to focus A, on strengthening our economy, but B, without a planet we can't sustain our lifestyles. So there's two things that we have to balance, and I believe it's possible, but you have to be pragmatic. You have to incentivize people to be green in this day and age. There's no point taxing and punishing the polluter. You have to encourage people to use public transport. You have to encourage people to enter into green initiatives. That's why with the Green Investment Bank, it's 3.8 billion of government funding that has gone into this bank, and it has attracted investment from private investors into various projects. So here in Cambridge, we're developing the energy centre at Addenbrooke's Hospital to cut the carbon emissions at the hospital, because the boilers and the systems at Addenbrooke's are in excess of 25 years old and heavy pollutants. That money is 18 million that's come from the Green Investment Bank, and it's another 18 million from a private investor. Now you can't get people to put money into green industrial projects unless they have either government backing behind them or they have an incentive. So whilst it may seem that we're at polar opposites, if we miss the opportunity to embrace the green agenda, that's our loss.
Well, the question was about GDP, so I'm going to address the question. And what I have to say is very straightforward. GDP is an absolutely disastrous measure. It's led us completely up a blind alley, and it's leading us to destruction. But be very clear, when the other parties here tonight, as they always do, call for economic growth, what they're calling for is more GDP. That's what it means, right? So the situation is very clear and simple. The Green Party is the one party that is saying we need to bring an end to this fetishism of economic growth, because we have to respect planetary limits. If we do not do that, then, I mean, why would we even bother turning up here this evening? We are breaching planetary limits on biodiversity and on climate, most notably, also various others. We have to stop. This is an absolutely defining issue of our time and of our generation, and there's no getting away from it. If you think that there's a way of combining growthism with taking the planet seriously, you're mistaken. And I have proof here. It's a book called The Post-Growth Project, produced by the think tank that I chair, called Greenhouse. I invite you to read it. It's in, as they say, all the bookshops. But very briefly, what we lay out in the book is how further economic growth is no longer desirable, no longer possible, and no longer necessary. And how, if we are serious about respecting planetary limits, about all the issues we're talking about this evening, we have to get our head around that. We have to move away from GDP, and we have to start thinking about prioritizing the well-being of humans and other species, and we can do that.
Well, the first few words Rupert said I completely agree with, because GDP is a rubbish measure, and it's a problem whether you're taking a green view or a non-green view, because it's actually what gives people like George Osborne the room to carry out the kinds of sleight of hand we saw in the budget this week. Basically, Britain's economy is recovering partly because we've got many more people here, actually partly because the Conservatives' migration target was completely busted, and that's actually good for the economy. So we've got a bigger economy, more people. A much better measure, of course, would be GDP per capita, which gives you a completely different account. So on the first level, yes, we should change the measure. Can we? That's quite a hard thing to do, because actually what you're trying to do is convince a whole range of people, a whole range of economic players, to change the way they operate. And successive governments have had a go at this kind of thing, and of course they've been completely ignored. This government has actually done some quite good things in terms of changing the measures. The previous Labour government tried to introduce quality of life indicators, which were largely ignored. So I think it's a hard thing to do. On the bigger point about should we be stopping growth, my party's policy is quite clear. No, we do continue growth, but you can turn it on its head. If you have a green economy, which is actually creating green jobs, then actually you can completely turn things around. So I think this deserves a very, very long, complicated answer. I appreciate you don't necessarily want us to do that. We may want to come back and explore it further.
I mean, look, this is a brilliant question. It's actually something I spoke about in my maiden speech because I care so much about it. GDP is a rubbish measure of anything we should actually care about. If we, so I apologise, people I've said this to before, but if we were to smash this room up and then it were fixed, GDP's gone up. Great, everyone's doing better, it's all wonderful. Hang on. If you smoke and get lung cancer and get treatment, GDP goes up. Spill oil at sea, clear it up, GDP's gone up. None of these are good measures of anything we should care about at all. So one of the things that I've been pushing for is looking at well-being, and we've heard a bit of comments about this, and I've been vice chair of the all-party group on well-being economics for the last 5 years, to try to come across measures of things that actually matter to us. Because we're starting to learn what people actually care about. Seeing a nice green space, being able to go out to the countryside, makes us feel happier. We are better off that way, even though there's no money necessarily attached to it. Having friends, having hobbies, having interests makes a huge difference. I don't know if the research has been done. I suspect being a member of Transition Cambridge increases your well-being. Fascinating project to do. So we have to try to move that way. We've started measuring it in this government, and that's a good start. But there is way more to do to actually have well-being impact assessments on government policies, which is something we've called for. I haven't brought a copy of a book that I've got, but our group has published a detailed series of reports on what we can do, how it interacts with mental health, how it interacts with arts and the creative sector. The shift away from GDP to things that matter, that pick up factors like unemployment, that pick up many of those important parts of the normal economic argument, that is something I hope we'll be able to make more progress on in the next Parliament.
Come back on anything that anyone else has said or anything they want to add on this particular issue. So let's start with Rupert.
So, just two quick things. What Julian just said is great, but I'd make the point again. When you talk about increasing economic growth, increasing GDP is what you're talking about. And that is what we hear over and over again from the Conservatives, from Labour, from the Liberal Democrats. Unless you're going to actually think outside that box, then all the fine words in the world about well-being don't mean a thing. Because you're still increasing the overall level of economic activity. And you are still making more impacts upon the planet in the process. And there's no way around that. The research is very clear from Peter Victor and Tim Jackson and others. There is no trajectory, there is no plausible trajectory, there is no model, there is no extant example of increasing economic activity, of increasing economic growth, or increasing GDP, and reducing our impacts fast enough to deal with climate impacts and other major impacts. Quick point on what Daniel said. The fantasy of green growth is there. Of course, green growth is possible in particular sectors. What I'm talking about is across the entire economy. And across the entire economy, green growth is a fantasy just like clean coal is a fantasy. That's the point. You cannot keep on growing GDP if you're actually serious about remaining within planetary boundaries.
Daniel?
Well, I think we're getting into the nitty-gritty here now about where you think the levels of sustainability are. And this is where I think actually Labour's got a good record in the sense that the Climate Change Act of 2008, which was, I think, only 2 or 3 MPs actually voted against at the time. There was such a good consensus. And I think it's a bit of a tragedy, actually, that since then that consensus has broken down with half the Conservative Party peeling away from it. But the key point about that was, I suspect there are plenty of people in this room who are more expert on this than I am, but for those who aren't, I'll give the very simple account about actually setting out a structured way of looking ahead to see what you need to do, work back, set carbon budgets, have an independent commission which government has to listen to. That's what's actually happening at the moment. We're on the 4th carbon budget. 5th one looks like it's going to be a whole lot more difficult to do. But to actually do it in a structured way which allows for us to get to where we need to get to, where we can begin to negotiate with other countries so that they need to get where they get to, that to me is a structured way of doing it, which is, I think, our best chance of getting out of the very difficult predicament we're in. My criticism of Julian's approach is I have nothing against it in principle, but it just hasn't been happening. And the problem is we are in a global international system which does look at things like GDP, and the pragmatic, practical thing you've got to answer is how do you actually deal with that? And I think that's probably going to be the kind of dividing line tonight between the idealism on one side and hard, pragmatic, practical approach, which I believe Labour is in the best place to deliver.
I I think Rupert, with respect, has missed the fact that there are still people who haven't got jobs who want to work. Unemployment is still a problem in this country. So if you say no to growth, you say no to those people getting jobs. We in the Conservative Party actually want to get to a stage of full employment where everyone who wants to work has a job available to them. So the reality is we have to grow, we have to have a strong economy, and actually with a strong economy, look at what we've achieved. We've managed to put $4 billion into the International Climate Fund to help developing nations tackle their problems that they're facing in terms of climate change. We couldn't do that without money.
Just two quick things. Firstly, Daniel accused me of being an idealist. I'm quite happy to admit to being an idealist. I think it's quite possible to be idealistic and to make a pragmatic, sensible difference at the same time, and that's the spot that I'd like to be in. The other thing, just something that Chamali said way back at the beginning, which nobody's picked up on, was that she said that there's no point taxing the polluters. I think the polluters are exactly the sort of people who ought to be paying, because that way you get some of that cost of pollution taken into account in all the rest of their activities. So I have to say I don't agree on that. I would tax the polluters.